University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello and welcome back to Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Nick Pereso.
And I'm Thomas Krasnation. We're excited to bring you an interview we did with retired Admiral James Stavridis to discuss his naval career, policy making at NATO, retired flag officers in politics, and international peace building and security. We also talked about the relationship between the Department of Defense and journalism. Admiral Stavridis is best known for serving as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO from 2009 to 2013. In that position, he oversaw all NATO military operations. During that time, he served concurrently as Commander of U.S. European Command, in charge of all U.S. military operations in Europe. After retiring from the Navy, he became Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and is now a consultant, news commentator, and chairman of the U.S. Naval Institute in Annapolis, Maryland. Admiral Stavridis is a prolific author, and his most recent book discusses the importance of sea power.
Here's the interview.
Admiral Stavridis, thank you so much for joining us today on Thank You for Your Service. We really appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure to join.
Sir, the end of your career in the Navy, you served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO from 2009 to 2013. Now, most people know that NATO was founded to counteract the Soviet Union, but there's no longer a Soviet Union today. So how has NATO's role and mission evolved over the last few decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
There were actually three reasons for the formation of NATO, one of which you mentioned. And a simple shorthand is a quote from Lord Pug Ismay, who was the first Secretary General of NATO. And he said that NATO was formed to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And that's kind of shorthand for, yes, it was a bulwark against the Soviet Union, but it had two other important purposes. One was to keep the United States engaged in the affairs of Europe. And the other was to ensure that European nations did not end up going to war again. In fact, I always said as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO that the greatest accomplishment of NATO is not that no other nation ever attacked a NATO nation. The greatest accomplishment of NATO is that no NATO nation attacked another NATO nation, in the sense that Europe had been roiled by war for 2,000 years, but now has enjoyed 70 years of peace on that continent, largely because of NATO. Which brings us to what's relevant today about NATO. I would argue all three of those fundamental missions still exist. That while Russia, the Russian Federation, is a mere shadow of the former Soviet Union, it's still dangerous. It's still a difficult interlocutor. They've invaded Ukraine. They put undue pressure on peripheral countries around their borders. And they kind of threaten NATO a little bit. They try to put pressure on the Baltic states and so forth. So I think there's still a NATO mission in deterring Russian adventurism in Europe. Secondly, NATO is an important part of keeping Europe relatively unified. And that's even more important now as the Brits contemplate, and I think will, pull out of the European Union, as the Italians are less and less inclined to be part of the European project, as we see Poland and Hungary pulling away in the east. So I think NATO is still a kind of a glue that can help hold the European project together. And thirdly, let's face it, the United States under President Trump seems less inclined to want to be globally involved in ways that we've been in the past. So I think NATO provides a kind of a plank, if you will, in the transatlantic bridge. It's creaking a little bit, But I think all three of those missions are still important. And therefore, I think NATO, if you will, kind of 2.0, 3.0 even, is still quite relevant.
So you mentioned already the current administration, the current president's previous comments about NATO. There's an impression out there that this administration is skeptical about the importance of NATO. And in your role, your former role as the Supreme Allied Commander, you serve under the American president as an American military officer and also as a NATO 4-star. So how would you respond to that in that role? What kinds of things would you be talking about in your conversations with Allied officials or military leaders?
Well, you're right to put your finger on the duality of being both the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, in which you report to, in my day, 28 nations, today 29 nations with the addition of Macedonia. So in your NATO hat as Supreme Allied Commander, you're reporting to the heads of state and government of 29 separate nations. And so I would go and brief President Obama and Nicolas Sarkozy of France and Angela Merkel of Germany and David Cameron of the United Kingdom, et cetera. So in that hat, you have kind of 29 bosses, if you will, in the North Atlantic Council, as it's called. You are also a U.S. combatant commander in charge of all U.S. forces in Europe and the Levant. And that job, of course, is called a Commander U.S. European Command. And in that job, you report to the Secretary of Defense and then to the President. So two very separate jobs, but they kind of come together in the sense that the U.S. forces in Europe are also part of the Supreme Allied Commander's remit and part of his or her force structure. And therefore, the two jobs come together in the single person. To give you a practical example of this, when General Wesley Clark was the Supreme Allied Commander, he got in a fairly contentious situation with the then Secretary of Defense, Secretary Cohen. And this is well documented in General Clark's memoir. And in that case, Secretary Cohen was trying to give him direction about how to act as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And General Clark said to Secretary Cohen, "Sir, as you know, I'm an alliance officer, and I want you to know that I'm listening intently to everything you are telling me with 1/16 of my mind," meaning there are 15 other nations to whom he also had to report. I thought that was a pretty bold statement. I'm not sure I would have said that to Secretary Gates, but I think that it was an accurate statement that any Supreme Allied Commander owes the United States its fair share of attention, but you have to listen equally to the Brits and the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Bulgarians. And if you do that well, you can balance all that in ways that do not become contentious. And then when your U.S. boss, Secretary of Defense, wants to tell you to do something in your U.S. hat with your U.S. forces, of course, you're going to salute smartly and move out and do that. So it requires a complexity of, I would say, both command and control and also personality in order to manage those twin jobs.
I think what makes the role of Supreme Allied Commander really unique as well is that you're dealing with defense policy making, but at an international level. Can you talk a little bit about how that international perspective with defense policy making might be uniquely different from the national concern?
Sure. Let's, again, practical example. Let's take Afghanistan. As the Supreme Allied Commander, one of my many missions was the NATO mission to Afghanistan, and I had about 150,000 troops working for me in that capacity there from the 28 nations of NATO and from 22 other nations. There were troops on the ground from 50 different allied partner and friend countries. And so you had a vast majority of input from all of these different nations about how and where their troops should be deployed and under what constraints they could operate. These were called caveats. And it was extremely complex to manage that. And The thing that it required, frankly, was getting on the jet and going to national capitals and working hard to understand the culture, the history, the current circumstances of each of these nations so that you could best accommodate their desires and their ability to contribute. And the way I would phrase that is we should spend less time yelling at our allies about trying to get them to do something that in the end they're not going to do, and instead spend time finding out what they are willing to do and bringing it all together. I'll close with a quote from Churchill, who said that the only thing worse than trying to fight a war with a bunch of different allies is trying to fight a war without any allies. I think that makes a lot of sense. In other words, let each contribute according to their abilities and forgive them when they cannot contribute in some particular way. Because at the end of the day, the net of all of us working together is always going to be stronger than any one of us, even the United States working alone.
So I was talking to one of our friends here at UChicago about this interview. I was telling him that we're interviewing Admiral Stavridis, and he said, oh, that's that guy who was on the short list for Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nomination. And we did look that up. The New York Times reported that you were being considered as a vice presidential nominee in the last campaign. And then later that year, after the election, you were rumored to be in the running for Secretary of State. That had to have been a really interesting several months for you.
It was, and both are true. And I was vetted for vice president, one of only 6 people that were formally vetted by the campaign. Although I have to tell you, when I was first approached about whether I'd be interested in being vetted for vice president and being on the short list for vice president, I said, surely you mean you're collecting a list of short people, because I'm only 5'5" tall. And that was the only short list I could imagine being on. And I also told John Podesta, who was Hillary's campaign manager, former chief of staff in the White House, I said, you know, John, this is never going to work out because Stavridis is too long to fit on a bumper sticker. And so I enjoyed is probably the wrong word, but I learned a lot going through the vetting process. And had she been elected, I would have been willing to go into government and serve in her administration. Then the election happened, and I was approached at that point by Reince Priebus, who was the chief of staff to the President-elect Trump, and he invited me down to Trump Tower for an interview. And I went down there and had a pretty good conversation with President Trump for about an hour, and was ultimately offered potentially a cabinet-level position. I declined that at the end of the day because I felt I had too many fundamental policy disagreements with President-elect Trump over everything from NATO to the walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership to the position of the administration on the environment. I just had a lot of fundamental policy disagreements. And so I felt I could not effectively serve. My takeaway from all of that is as a military officer, a former military officer, I'm a registered independent. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I was vetted by one party. I was offered a cabinet post by another party. And I think that's what former senior military and former military can best bring to the political process is a sense of independence from partisan issues and a desire to serve the country. And I commend people like General Kelly and General Mattis and General McMaster who chose to step up and serve. And I think that former military at every level, be they 03s or 06s or 010s, hopefully would bring, generally speaking, a centrist view, a nonpartisan view, and a policy and practically oriented view toward the world. That's what I hoped to do in one of those 2 posts. Neither worked out at that moment, but perhaps I'll loop back for another bite at the apple at some point.
And when General Madison, General Kelly, and McMaster all did enter the administration, there was this